I was 62 the morning my phone turned my kitchen into a courtroom. The light was clean and ordinary, the kind that makes stainless steel look honest. My coffee had just bloomed in the press, peppering the air with that reliable bitterness retired teachers like me learn to appreciate after years of grading essays at dawn. My name is Carolyn. I have been a widow for 7 years, a mother for 31, and for too long I mistook sacrifice for love. When the phone chimed, I wiped my hands on a dish towel stitched with lemons and reached for it like I always do, expecting a grocery ad or a notification about the neighborhood watch. I did not expect a sentence that could fold a lifetime in half. You won't be joining us. My wife prefers to keep it only family. I read it twice and felt something quiet and careful in me sit down on the floor. Later I would understand that shame prefers whispering. It wants you to feel silly for hurting. In that moment, though, all I knew was that the morning had been split, and I was on the side of the room with the broken plates. I have one son. David is tall in the way that tricks people into thinking he has decided something. He married Melanie 3 years after his father died. At first I was grateful. She laughed easily, knew which fork went with which salad, and took photographs of our dinners, as if capturing the food might save us from grief. I met her at the worst moment a woman can remake herself, and I mistook her competence for kindness. When they were starting out, I told myself I could be the cushion under their first hard year. I had savings from decades of teaching small miracles stacked upon each other, every coupon, and skipped restaurant bill a brick in a wall I built against emergency. I bought them a house. I chose the paint, the tiles that feel cool under bare feet, the curtains with the forgiving hems. I co-signed a dozen small conveniences they called necessities. I told myself this was love. If you were to walk through their living room even now, you would trip over my generosity in every corner. When David's text landed, it did not accuse, it did not explain. It offered the kind of politeness that helps cruelty pass for planning. Only family. The words behaved like a gate. They looked simple, but they closed on a hinge that had been oiled for years. I poured the coffee, took a sip I couldn't taste, and put the cup down on the saucer with 2 hands. I had the sudden humiliating thought that I must have misread it, as if there were a nicer sentence hiding beneath the one on the screen. A minute later I typed OK, because OKs are what women send when they are bleeding, and do not want to get any on the furniture. I would like to tell you I cried, that I thumped the counter, and demanded the universe make a sound as loud as my hurt. But I have always been a quiet weeper, and that morning I was dry as paper. The house did the crying for me. The refrigerator hummed with an anxious throat. The clock cleared its voice too often. The floor complained under my steps as if I had gained weight in secrets. I moved through the rooms, inventorying the gestures that had built the life David now edited me out of, the crib I sanded and repainted when he was a baby, so it would be good enough for a boy who would always be good enough for me, the rocker I nursed him in, the framed photographs of beach vacations I paid for, because the ocean is a better therapist than most men will see. I noticed how the frames held not memories but receipts. I called Nancy because old friends are the only people who can hold a silence without turning it into a mirror. She arrived without asking for permission, the way grief enters a house it already knows. We did not talk much. She read the message herself when I pushed the phone across the table. I watched her jaw find a new shape. She put her palm on the table near mine, not touching, just close enough for heat to prove itself. She said a sentence I pretended not to hear. You made yourself so useful they forgot you were human. I laughed, the weak kind that stumbles over its own knees. Then I told her I needed to check something, and she reached for my laptop like a midwife reaching for a towel. Melanie is good at logistics. It was one of the first things I admired about her. She knows how to turn life into a spreadsheet with enough color coding to convince you chaos is just a bad mood. When my husband died, I let her help with my online accounts. This will give you peace of mind, she said. And I believed her because my mind was a wilderness, and peace is the kind of word that can lead you into a trap if you're thirsty enough. That morning, with Nancy's steadiness leaning against the kitchen air, I signed in everywhere my name lived. At first the numbers behaved. Checking, savings, retirement. Nothing screamed. That's the discipline of certain kinds of theft. They prefer a whisper. I widened the search. Small transfers, routine labels, home maintenance, property tax adjustments, household reimbursement. The amounts were modest, polite, even the way a parasite is smart enough to praise your good health while it eats. I clicked a trail of breadcrumbs no one expected me to notice at my age, and there it was, a secondary user added months ago. Not my son's name. It was hers. I put my hand over my mouth, not because I was going to be sick, but because a sound had risen in me I did not want to learn. I printed what we found. The printer taught the kitchen to breathe differently, with each page, each small exhale of proof. When the stack cooled, I slid it into a folder marked with the stubborn teacher's label maker font that has carried me from classroom to retirement context. It felt like building a spine. Nathan Harris has been my attorney since before David had his first loose tooth. When I called, his voice took off its shoes. He made room in his day, and in the chair opposite his desk, I became a person again instead of a wallet with a clean conscience. I told him what I had found. He asked careful questions and did not use the tone men use when they are making women feel dramatic for telling the truth. He said we would begin with the simplest, accurate sentence: revoke every permission that makes you small. Then we would write a truer one, transfer my life back to my own name. He warned me that the law is slow and that paper once signed grows a skeleton of its own. He did not tell me to be patient, which I appreciated, because women who have spent their lives apologizing for their appetites should not be asked to apologize for their urgency. When I got home, there was an envelope under my door. Plain, white, familiar. Melanie uses that stationery when she is about to normalize a decision that will cost me. I held it in the flat of my hand, the way one holds a photograph that might contain a ghost. Inside, the language was tidy. The columns aligned, the font confident. It took 2 paragraphs of courteous sentences to arrive at the word that wanted my leash irrevocable. I read the clause twice: power of attorney, health decisions, facility admission authority, estate access without contest. The document did not say we love you. It said we prefer you defenseless. I placed it back in its envelope and sat down like a woman learning to place her feet where they will hold. In the hours that followed, I invented a new way to move through my house. I opened drawers and met my life as if I were a historian of a small country called Carolyn. I sorted keys by the doors they still owned and the ones they had pretended to. I found my husband's old notebook from our mortgage years, every payment a proud X, and on the inside cover his handwriting said a sentence I had nearly forgotten: take care of tomorrow before it remembers to take care of you. I pressed the words with my thumb, the way you test fruit for ripeness. I returned to Nathan's office with the envelope. He read until his breath sounded like someone has finally chosen the right weapon, which in civilized rooms is always paper arranged in a truthful order. This isn't just poor judgment, he said, and that was the last time either of us called it anything less than what it was. I did not tell David where I was going. I did not prepare a speech. I drove past their house, the one I had purchased twice, once with money and once with patience, and saw the ornamental grasses I had planted scribbling their dry music against the porch rails. I thought of all the hours I had spent making their life soft, so that mine could be ignored without anyone tripping over the sharp edges. At a red light, I saw in the rear view a woman who looked like my mother the year she stopped dyeing her hair. She looked finished with being invisible. I nodded to her, which is what you do to a stranger you recognize. People like to imagine that betrayal arrives with cymbals and thunder. Mine came dressed like good manners. That is the thing I want you to understand if you are listening, because you are standing in your own quiet kitchen with a phone in your hand and a sentence on the screen asking you to please disappear. Sometimes the cruelest thing is not the cut, it is the way they wrap it in language that makes you feel impolite for bleeding. I spent the evening making lists the way some women knit to keep their fingers from forgetting they can hold. By midnight, I had the names of every bill I had been paying like a nanny on direct deposit, every subscription running beneath the conversation like a river, every favor I had called love. I slept badly, which is to say, I slept exactly like a woman who has finally admitted there is work to do. In the morning, I put on the black dress my husband always admired because it made me stand up straighter, and I went to the bank. I learned the names of people who had been making decisions about my life while assuming I would never walk in and ask for them. I signed forms that took my name back from the places it had been borrowed without interest. I listened to a young manager apologize in the language corporations teach their employees to use when they have been careless with someone's trust. I let him speak. Then I asked him to print everything and to staple it neatly so that my anger would have something tidy to hold. When I stepped back out into the daylight, the world had the audacity to behave as if this were an ordinary Thursday. A dog dragged a child toward a patch of clover. A delivery truck honked in a tone that suggested it had a sense of humor and a schedule. I stood on the curb and felt the strangest thing. Lightness, not because I had won anything yet, but because I had finally stopped asking to be chosen. I had chosen myself, which is both the simplest and most scandalous sentence a certain kind of mother will ever say out loud. Back home, I opened my secretary desk and made a new folder. I labeled it with the precision of a woman who has graded too many essays to tolerate vagueness, reclamation. I placed the bank printouts, the attorney's plan, the envelope with the trap that had expected me to be tired. I added a note in my own handwriting, the teacher's hand that once drew red circles around sentences too lazy to carry their meaning. It is not your job to make them comfortable inside the story of your generosity. It is your job to speak facts and keep your keys. I boiled more water for tea I did not sweeten. Then I sat by the window where the afternoon light likes to tell the truth about dust, and I told myself the secret people rarely say in public because it embarrasses them to admit how long they allowed hope to do their math. It isn't that they stopped loving you, it's that they never learned what loving costs when the money is yours. A car door slammed somewhere up the street. A breeze argued with the wind chime. My phone lit the table again with a new message, not an apology, but a schedule suggestion. Sunday could work, David wrote as if I had been a meeting to be moved. I turned the phone face down. The lemon-stitched towel looked like summer. For the first time in a long time, I believed I might live long enough to taste it. The next morning, I woke to the sound of the garbage truck declaring itself to the street like a brass band. It rattled the windows and shook the cups in the cabinet, and for a second I loved its lack of subtlety. So much of my life had been conducted in whispers. It soothed me to hear something mechanical and unapologetic doing exactly what it came to do. I made coffee and stood barefoot on the cool tile, reading the notes I'd left in the reclamation folder the night before. There is a peace that comes from seeing your own handwriting choose you. I thought of the evening staff meetings I used to run, the way I'd tell first-year teachers that clarity is a form of kindness. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped offering that kindness to myself and mistaken secrecy for grace. A new email arrived from Nathan's office. He had spent the late hours pulling the strings that allowed Melanie's name to knot itself into my finances, and the string in the center wasn't a law at all. It was trust. You granted shared access to 2 utilities during the estate cleanup, he wrote. Those portals exchanged verification with your bank because they were all under the same email and automatically recognized the sign-in device. It is a design flaw wrapped in convenience. The sentence made me want to laugh and cry in equal measure. Isn't that always how it happens? A shortcut presents itself, and before you know it, you've reached a destination that looks nothing like the address you intended. He had scheduled an appointment with a fraud specialist from the bank's regional office. Bring everything he wrote. Bring yourself. At 10, Nancy came by with croissants that flaked themselves over my table like confetti from a celebration we had not yet named. She watched me seal envelopes and slide pages into plastic sleeves as if we were packing a suitcase for a country where I would need every word to pass the border. "You have your mother's walk today," she said when I stood and reached for my purse, the one she used when she went to fight the cable company because they kept charging her for a channel she didn't watch. I smiled at the memory of my mother's small, indignant dignity, her pocketbook tucked under her arm, like a weapon made of leather and receipts. "I am my mother's daughter," I said, and I let the sentence settle into the room like a chair pulled out for an old friend. The regional branch sat behind a parking lot that smelled faintly of hot tar and summer. Inside, the air conditioning performed its impersonation of mercy. They ushered me into a glass-walled meeting room that tried to be kind by being transparent. The specialist, Lena, wore a navy blazer that could have been a uniform or a comfort blanket. She shook my hand with two hands, as if to show me she had nothing hidden in either. "I've listened to 3 calls tied to your account," she said without ceremony. "In 2 of them, the caller fails voice verification. In both, the agent overrides after being given personal details." She pressed a button and played one of the recordings. The speaker was a woman, her voice pitched in the friendly, faintly harried tone of someone who wants to seem reasonable while pushing a door with her shoulder. "It's my mother-in-law's card," she said. "She hates the phone. I manage this. It's easier for everyone." In the small silence after the word, "everyone," my heart did a slow, wide turn. I had used a version of that sentence 1,000 times. It's easier for everyone if I do it. There is a violence to convenience that we rarely name because the wound it makes is lack. Lena stopped the recording and slid a form toward me. "We'll attach this to the internal report," she said. "It documents every unauthorized change. It names who requested it and who approved it. It doesn't undo everything, but it gives consequence a spine." Her words landed softly and then hardened the way cement is poured wet and becomes a sidewalk strong enough to hold a crowd. "Your son's name is not on these calls," she added, "but the address of record is theirs." I nodded. Truth rarely arrives in a single outfit. It layers itself. On my way out, I passed a bulletin board crowded with cheerful posters about budgeting. One had a picture of a piggy bank wearing a cape. It was trying too hard to be adorable. I stood in front of it and thought about all the years I had been my family's cape, the little hero in the corner of every crisis, the woman who flew in with a casserole and a check, and a silence that made everyone more comfortable than honest. I wondered who I was without the costume. The thought did not frighten me as much as it should have. In the glass reflection, I caught a woman with silver at her temples. She looked durable. She looked finished with costumes. When I returned home, I found a cream envelope sticking out of the mail slot, fatter than it needed to be. There was no return address. The handwriting on the front was the kind that mistakes flourish for elegance. Inside was a note folded around a stack of photographs. The note was written in Melanie's cautious cursive. "Carolyn, it said it has been a difficult week. I'm sure this is a misunderstanding. We all love you. Please sign the new forms Nathan will send so that we can resume care coordination. We're worried about you. Enclosed are pictures from the last 4th of July at the lake. You looked happy." The word happy made my jaw ache. I looked at the photographs. There I was on a dock, the late sun trying to make me gold, my smile obedient. Behind me, David's hand rested on Melanie's shoulder, in a tableau that would have convinced strangers we were a picture of ease. If you stare long enough at certain photographs, you can watch them tell the truth beneath the pose. My eyes were not on the camera. They were on the cooler where I had packed everyone's favorites in neat, guilty rows. I called Nathan and read the note out loud. He listened without interrupting. "She wants you to be the hallway," he said softly. "A passage to their convenience. Close the door." Then he told me something that shifted the floor under me with an elegant, terrifying gentleness. "Your husband left you a letter I forgot we had," he said. "When he first made the will, he wrote a personal note to accompany it. It was filed separately and never delivered because there was no event that triggered it. I came across it pulling older records. Do you want me to bring it, or—" He trailed off, and I could hear him deciding whether to say the kind thing or the legal thing. "Bring it," I said. "Bring him." He knocked that afternoon with a manila envelope that had lived longer than some marriages. He did not sit until I asked him to. He placed the envelope on the table like a priest setting down a lit candle. Inside was a single page in my husband's tall, careful hand. He had always printed his letters when he wanted to be sure there would be no argument about what he meant. Carrot began his nickname for me, the one he had invented, because he said I carried us through every storm. If I go first, you will put your head down and go to work serving the people you love. You think I don't know this because I pretend I'm the practical one, but we both know how our home got built. Please do not love them past the point where you recognize yourself. If you must choose between being thought difficult and being used up, be difficult. I will not love you less for it. Keep the house in the lake. Do not sign anything when fear is in the room. Ask Nathan. Ask Nancy. Trust your own no. I read the letter 3 times each reading, changing the temperature of the kitchen. By the third, I felt like a woman who had found a life jacket that still fit. It would be tidy if I could say I called David then and told him to come and face what he had allowed to be built in our family in my name. But tidy is for file cabinets and the backs of closets after a long Saturday. I did something less cinematic and more dangerous to the story we had been telling about ourselves. I texted him and asked him to pick up a box I had packed of dishes he and Melanie had been storing in my garage for 3 years. 6 tonight, I wrote. Porch. He responded with a thumbs up, then the words, "Thanks, Mom," as if we were back in the year when please and thank you did not arrive wearing disguises. At 5:30, the sky pushed a heavy hand against the neighborhood, the kind of weather that makes the old wooden porches remember every nail. I carried the box out and set it beside the steps. I was wearing my husband's blue work shirt because it made me feel like the house would recognize me if the storm took out the lights. At 6 exactly, David pulled up. He is punctual when something is easy. He sat in the car for a minute, the engine pretending to be thoughtful. When he stepped out, he looked older than 31 and younger than the boy who used to fall asleep in my lap during baseball games. "Hey," he said, and the word behaved like a broom that had forgotten how to sweep. We stood there, mother and son, with a stack of plates between us like a very fragile truce. I could have reached for him and undone the world we had made, simply because I am better at cleaning than at letting messes teach their lesson. Instead, I put my hands in my pockets and waited for kindness to arrive with a spine. I listened to recordings, I said finally. She failed voice verification and insisted on overrides. The bank will send the report to the investigator. Nathan has filed to revoke permissions in every direction. We are building a plan for repayment that does not require me to mother your laziness. His mouth opened with a sentence he had taught himself to lean on since he was a teenager. This is being blown out of proportion, but his face remembered itself and shut the sentence in his teeth. I didn't know, he said, and the words were true in the way that excuses often are. They know just enough to pass inspection. You didn't ask, I said, and felt a piece of me stop burning. He looked at the window and then at the eaves and then at the storm, as if nature might lend him a softer answer. Melanie said it would streamline things, he offered. She said you hate phone trees and forms. I let myself wonder for a breath if I had written certain lines in this play. I had stood in front of too many holidays and offered to handle it. I had praised efficiency because it let me hide my hunger under a well-set table. Maybe I taught you to accept a kind of help that costs other people, I said. I'm sorry for that. The apology tasted like clean water. But I'm done paying for your convenience. The rain began in a flat, authoritative sheet. We both stepped back under the awning. The box of dishes looked heroic and absurd. He put his hand on it like a man steadying a ship that isn't going anywhere. What do you want me to do? He asked. And I realized then that this was the first time in years he had asked a question he intended to obey. Return what was taken, I said. Show up to the meeting with the bank and listen instead of talking. Sit with the counselor, Nathan recommended, and learn to build a life with the tools you have. And until I say otherwise, keep your wife off my accounts and out of my decisions. This house and the lake are not content for her page or collateral for your experiments. I watched the words land. They did not crack him. They rearranged him. Okay, he said. And it was the first honest okay he had given me since he was a boy with freckles and a habit of holding my hand at crosswalks. He lifted the box and walked it to the trunk. When he turned back, rain streaked his hair into a younger man's mess. "You aren't coming Sunday?" he asked. And there was an old hope in the question, the hope that I would forgive before the apology. "No," I said, and my voice was so quiet I nearly missed its courage. "Family dinners are for family." The sentence could have cut. I used it like a salve. He nodded the slow kind of nod men do when they have discovered gravity. "I'll call," he said. "After the bank." "After." He let the afters trail off. I answered, and went inside with my husband's letter in my pocket, the paper warm against my leg as if it had a pulse. That night, the storm pulled the neighborhood into one dark room. The power went out and every house on the street forgot who it was without wires. I lit the candles we keep for such moments and sat in the kitchen with a sweater around my shoulders, as if sweaters are the kind of armor that works on old wounds. In the silence, I heard the house speak a language I had missed under the machines. The refrigerator's modest breathing, the window's soft argument with the wind, the click and release of the cooling stove. I wrote another note to myself and slipped it into the reclamation folder. You are not abandoning your child. You are refusing to abandon yourself. If you must hold a door open, let it be to let yourself back in. When the lights blinked awake, my phone lit with a message from an unknown number. It was a photograph of the lake at dusk, taken from the dock where we had smiled on cue. No caption, just the water pretending it could keep a secret. I knew who had sent it. I placed the phone face down and went to bed knowing there are wars I no longer have to fight and rooms I no longer must enter just because someone else is knocking. The dark felt less like an enemy than a room where I could hear myself think. I woke to the kind of blue morning that behaves like mercy, a cool hand on a hot forehead. The storm had scrubbed the sky so clean, the neighbor's maple looked brand new. I brewed coffee and read my husband's letter again, the way you reread instruction manuals, not because you doubt the machine, but because you finally understand how it works. The paper had softened where my thumb kept finding the same sentence. If you must choose between being thought difficult and being used up, be difficult. I kept touching it, as if I might wear the words like a ring. Then I opened the reclamation folder and made a second list, not of bills or passwords, but of rooms in me I had let other people rent. I thought of all the Sunday afternoons I had spent in their kitchen rinsing plates I'd paid for in a sink I'd replaced, laughing at jokes I didn't find funny because it kept peace on a leash. It startled me how quickly a life can become a rehearsal for a part you never meant to audition for. Before noon, Lena from the bank called to say the internal report would be sealed by the end of the day. Her voice carried that careful mix of apology and resolve that only women who have had to learn both can manage without wobbling. She promised me copies, promised me words like unauthorized and override, and recordings on file, promised me the relief of an institution speaking in my defense. After we hung up, I called Nathan and asked a question that had arrived the night before like a small animal peeking out from under the porch. What about the lake? He was quiet for a breath, which I have learned is the sound the law makes when it chooses to be honest. There are older forms, he said. Your husband executed a transfer on death for the cabin naming you sole owner. We recorded it years ago. It's clean. I felt the kind of gratitude that makes you sit down. I had been preparing to fight for something already mine. Drive up this weekend, Nancy said when I told her. Air out the quilts. Let the water remember your name. We planned it like a field trip. I packed bread and cherries and the ugly mug David made in fifth grade art that has only ever held pencils and sorrow. I left early Saturday while the neighborhood was still yawning. The highway unspooled like a ribbon someone who loves me had laid down the night before. By the time the lake slid into view, a long silver sigh tucked between pines, I felt taller in my seat. The cabin looked exactly as it always had when I arrived alone. The screen door practicing its complaint, the porch boards greeting me with the small flecks of wood that knows your weight by heart. I set down my bag and stood very still, the way you do entering a chapel no one else remembers. For a minute, I was only sound birds negotiating a treaty, a far boat teasing the water, the undecided breeze trying out the chimes. I found the keys in the tin on the hook, the ones my husband insisted we keep, because a home should have rituals, even when it also has modern conveniences. The lock turned with the same stubbornness I have loved in every good thing that ever lasted. Inside, the air tasted like dust and pine and the faded sweetness of last summer's peaches. I opened windows until the curtains learned how to breathe again. I shook quilts in the sun and watched the porch become a museum of what it means to keep something threads a little thin, where feet had warmed them the faint shape of naps. In the bedroom, I found the tackle box where my husband used to hide letters when he wanted me to find them the second day after I'd had time to miss him. There was a note inside, not sweet, not tragic. Practical romance. A hand-drawn map of shut-off valves. The number of a plumber who won't charge you for the air he breathes. A list titled Things to Check When You Arrive, and beneath it in that square handwriting, I could recognize in a crowd of 1,000 pages, Bring Yourself. I laughed out loud, the startle of it giving me away to whatever small animals had been assuming the house belonged to them now. I made coffee thick enough to forgive my grief and carried the mug to the porch. It amazed me how a place could remember me better than people did. The lake didn't care who called me selfish. It asked only that I sit and look and let my breath lengthen to match its calm. After a while, the shape of my life here reassembled itself from muscle memory. I checked the propane-stacked kindling, wrote a grocery list that had never made room for shame. Somewhere in the middle of this liturgy, a truck rolled up tires speaking fluent gravel. I stood the old reflex to hide my concerns so well practiced it almost fooled me again. It was Rick, the sheriff's deputy whose wife once taught down the hall from mine. He stepped out with a hat he had no intention of removing. "Your lawyer called," he said, his voice a polite fence. "Told me to swing by, remind you we can do a property check if you ever worry about uninvited arrivals. Not because you can't handle yourself, because you shouldn't have to." We sat for a few minutes, like people who used to meet at school assemblies, and now had larger assemblies to manage. I told him what I needed, no drama, just clarity. If anyone other than me shows up with the notion that this porch belongs to them, I want the law to recognize my handwriting on the deed. He nodded. "We can be here if you plan a conversation," he said. "Not to make a show. To keep the story honest." His truck left its square of shade long after he drove away, a small blessing lingering on the ground. I texted Nathan, "If there is to be a meeting, let it be here." He replied with the kind of economy that feels like an answered prayer. Monday, 2 p.m. I told Nancy, who sent back a row of lemons and a sentence, "Wear the blue shirt." Ooh. That evening, alone on the porch, I let myself long for the days when David would run down the dock fearless, and I would hold my breath as if my lungs were a life jacket I could loan out. I loved him that thoroughly. Then, because nostalgia is a thief that steals your boundaries while it shows you home movies, I wrote myself a new instruction in the back of my husband's note. You can love a person and refuse to be their floor. The words steadied me the way a banister does when the stairs suddenly feel steeper than they used to. On Sunday, I drove back to town to meet Nancy at the diner, the one with the lavender pie that thinks too highly of itself and earns it. We chose the booth by the window like always. Nancy ordered the coffee as if the waitress had forgotten how to speak and surrendered with a smile. With her there, the world remembered how to be readable. "He called," she asked gently. "He texted," I said. I slid the phone across like a confession. David had sent 2 messages, one asking if I was still mad, the other suggesting we reset next week and move on. I watched Nancy's eyebrows do the math of those phrases. "Moving on without changing anything is the same as moving backward," she murmured. I thought of every time I had accepted "let's move on" as a truce when what it meant was, "Please put your hurt down where I don't have to see it." Monday came, dressed like a decision. I wore the blue shirt because the fabric had learned how to hold me up. Nancy rode with me because courage like pie is better shared. We arrived early and opened the windows to let the lake make its case in the background. My papers were in order, the kind of order that no longer announced itself as fury, but as housekeeping. At 2, I heard the car before I saw it, a careful hum, as if the engine had been told to behave. David pulled in and parked wrong diagonal the way he always had when he didn't want to admit he wasn't looking. He stepped out alone. For a moment, my body mistook him for the boy who used to hand me dandelions like apologies. Then Melanie's SUV appeared behind him, brisk and decisive as a calendar reminder. She stepped out with sunglasses, carving her face into someone easier to dislike. She looked at the porch with the measuring eye of a realtor and laughed as if laughter could purchase proximity. I felt something old in me rattle and then quiet. I was not the hallway anymore. Rick's truck rolled up without sirens. His presence the kind of punctuation that prevents sentences from being misread. He tipped his hat toward me and to the lake as if to say, "We will be civilized here." Nathan came too with a briefcase that didn't brag but knew what it could do. He greeted Rick like men who have signed forms in the back of rooms where women grew the spine of the plan. We didn't gather inside, we stayed on the porch because some conversations need light. What happened next would be simpler to tell you if I were a different kind of narrator. If this were vengeance, I could give you fireworks and ash. But what unfolded had the slow gravity of a tide making and remaking the shore. Nathan spoke facts, in a voice that made gossip impossible. The bank's internal report, the recordings of override calls, the dates and amounts of auto payments enrolled without my permission, the revocation of every authority that had mistaken my kindness for consent. He did not raise his voice because the truth doesn't need volume. Rick read with official patience the notice that this property is under my sole control and that any attempt to enter without my consent would be trespass. He did not look at Melanie when he said it. He looked at the paper, then at me. Melanie tried the usual keys. She suggested misunderstandings, blamed software, offered concern. "We were worried about you," she said in a tone designed to solicit applause for her benevolence, "so we just streamlined the—" She trailed off when Nathan produced the transcript of a call in which she described me as forgetful and difficult about forms and better off if we just take care of things. For a second, the sunglasses failed to garrison her face. I saw a bright, thin anger flicker there. The anger of a person who believes kindness should sit down when convenience walks in. David watched the page as if words could grow hands and pull him out of consequence. When Nathan finished a leaf, let go of its branch and fell between us a single ordinary thing reminding the day that the earth is still interested in gravity. I spoke last. I didn't perform. I told a short story in a steady voice about a teacher who paid for her son's future until the present decided she was a wallet. I told them I was returning the cart in the rain because I am decent and locking my own door because I am worthy. I told my son I loved him more than I loved my reputation for being agreeable. I told his wife that whatever corner of the internet had taught her to mistake access for intimacy had not taught her what a boundary was, and I was prepared to demonstrate. Then I offered the only mercy I could give without leaving myself out of the count. I would pursue criminal charges for the acts that were hers. For my son, I would accept a restorative path if he repaid, if he learned, if he stopped expecting me to lay down and call it love. No one applauded. "This is real life," the loons complained at the far end of the lake. Somewhere the chimes got an answer from a wind they didn't expect. Melanie left first, her tires spitting the driveway like a child. David stayed a man with the ruins of a script in his pocket. He asked if he could sit on the step for a minute. I let him. Sometimes the kindest thing a mother can do is not offer a chair. When he rose, he did not ask for a key. He said he would see Nathan on Thursday and Lena by Friday and a counselor by Monday, and for the first time since he was 10, he did not look over my shoulder to see if anyone would clean up after him. After they drove away, Rick stood for a moment with his thumbs hooked in his belt. "You did good," he said, which is not grammar, but is gospel. Nathan squeezed my shoulder and told me to eat something. Nancy hugged me in a way that moved my bones back into their correct places. When the porch emptied, the lake exhaled us all into evening. I sat with my husband's letter in my lap until the paper learned the shape of my knees. I did not feel triumphant. I felt finished with a certain kind of begging. I thought of the girls I had taught who apologized before asking to use the restroom of the way we train women to make their needs ornamental. I thought of my mother pocketbook under her arm, marching into the cable office and declaring that she would not pay for a channel that advertised itself as entertainment and delivered only noise. Perhaps all our hardest days are just a return to the girl we were when we first realized the world would not hand us permission slips. I went inside and washed my husband's blue shirt at the sink and hung it over a chair where the last light would dry it. The evening smelled like soap and lake and something I did not recognize at first because I had not brought it home in years. It was mine. The week after the porch felt like recovering from anesthesia. I was awake, but the world moved carefully, every sensation arriving with a delay, as if my nervous system were counting to 3 before admitting each truth. The quiet in my house was not empty anymore. It was occupied by new habits that wanted to be fed. I woke early and walked the neighborhood the same loop I had always walked, but with different eyes. Every porch light felt like a gentle permission. Every crack in the sidewalk looked less like neglect, and more like the way even cement must stretch to keep from breaking. I kept my husband's letter in my pocket, the way some women tuck a rosary into a purse. My thumb found the ridge of his capital T in trust, as if tracing a map out of a city that hadn't been built for me. Nathan called on Thursday morning with his courthouse voice all precision and no panic. The bank's internal report was finalized. Lena had attached the recordings, the override notes, the agent IDs. "It's thorough," he said, which is a lawyer's word for the relief that comes from paper telling the same story your bones have been trying to say. He had filed the restitution agreement with the court, notarized and sealed. David had signed his portion with a hand that must have shook because the line wavered like a man learning to write with his non-dominant arm. For Melanie, the district attorney proposed a plea fines mandatory ethics coursework and a prohibition on managing anyone else's finances for 5 years. "It's not about vengeance," Nathan said softly, stealing my line and handing it back to me smoothed and warm. "It's about making the boundary visible." That afternoon, I cleaned the kitchen the way my mother used to when she needed to decide something slowly, with the kind of attention that makes a sink gleam and a mind deliberate. I lined the spices in soldier rows and threw away the sauces that promised to keep forever, but had become a science experiment. I found behind a stack of pie tins the ceramic mug David made in 5th grade, the one with a misshapen handle and a heart carved into the glaze with a toothpick. For years it had been a pencil cup, a small thrift store of my patience. I washed it by hand and set it on the windowsill. The light stepped in and tried it on like a hat. I stood there drying my hands on the lemon-stitched towel and felt an old ache push up through the floorboards and into my ankles, the ache of wanting to rewind to the boy with wet hair and sand in his ears and hold him in the doorway of a life he did not yet know how to enter without breaking the hinges. But I didn't bargain with the ache. I let it pass through like weather, and when it had, the kitchen looked exactly the same and completely different. David met with Lena on Friday. He texted after, not with the brittle jokes he uses when he needs me to pretend nothing is wrong, but with 4 words he must have rehearsed so much they lost their shine. "I am doing it." That night he called, and for a while we did that strange ritual adults perform when they are trying to grow back a relationship, talking about small things with careful respect, the way you approach a skittish animal you hope will let you feed it from your palm. He told me about the counselor's office, the eucalyptus and old carpet, the way his own voice surprised him when it said out loud the sentence he had avoided for years. "I don't know how to be a man who doesn't borrow a woman's backbone." I told him I was baking for the church sale lemon squares because my hands know how to measure sugar when my heart is counting grief. When we hung up, I did not cry. I set the phone down and felt the floor of my life hold. On Sunday, I drove to the lake alone and let the road lengthen my breath. The porch remembered me before I stepped onto it. The boards carried my weight like a familiar argument they were happy to have again. I opened windows and the curtains nodded yes. I laid quilts over the rail. The lake had that particular June color that looks like a secret you've been trusted with. I swept the floor in long, confident strokes and realized halfway through that I was smiling, not because everything was fixed, but because I was finally not pretending to be smaller than the room required. When I finished, I carried a chair to the end of the dock and sat with my feet just above the water, my husband's letter folded in my pocket, the paper pressing a square against my thigh like a gentle insistence. A loon called its old complaint at the far cove and got an answer from deep water. "I hear you," I said to the lake, to the letter, to the part of me that had been listening so long without permission to speak. Nancy came up the following weekend with a cooler that argued for its importance with every clunk. She walked through the cabin as if she were checking a student's first classroom setup, the desk's placement, the way the light falls, the quiet bravery of small choices. We ate cherries until our fingers looked like we'd signed something in red ink. We sat on the steps while the afternoon made that soft, expensive light that makes you believe you are in a photograph someone will keep. "You look like yourself," she said finally. And it was the truest compliment anyone had offered me in years. We practiced saying no out loud, trying it on like a new coat. "No, I won't be joining. No, I won't co-sign that. No, I won't be your hallway." And then we laughed because the words did not crack our faces off when our mouths made them. They felt simple. They felt like returning the grocery cart in the rain. You do it because you are decent. You do it because civilization cannot hold without such small obediences to what is right. The summer arranged itself around my different posture. Church ladies who had watched me carry bake sales on my back without complaint began to notice that I put only one pan of lemon squares on the table and kept one for myself and Nancy on the porch afterward. Neighbors waved differently, slower, as if waiting to be invited, not assuming they were entitled to a conversation that would cost me my evening. I started reading on the dock at sunset, not to be seen but to learn again what it feels like to be absorbed by a thing that asks nothing from you beyond your eyes. I chose difficult books and simple dinners. I slept through 3 storms. When my mind woke at 2 with worry tapping the glass, I read my husband's letter again and felt the tapping turn into rain and the rain into sleep. Melanie called once from a number I didn't recognize, the bravado in her hello thin as a kite string in wind. She wanted to clarify the optics, a phrase that does not belong in a family's mouth. I listened until I recognized the form of the conversation, an invitation to set myself on fire to keep the room warm, and then I ended it gently, the way you take a match from a child. "We are done discussing perception," I said. "We are dealing with paper." She tried 2 more times in the weeks that followed with numbers that thought they were clever. In both cases, I let the phone perform its greatest kindness. Silence is a boundary too. One afternoon in late July, David drove up to the lake alone with a bag of groceries and a face that looked like it had been taking a class on humility and had not failed the quizzes. He stood at the edge of the yard and waited for my nod. He did not walk onto the porch until I nodded again. We sat on the steps, mother above son, below the hierarchy we had forgotten, reassembling not as punishment, but as physics. The heavier object at rest, the lighter one, learning to hold its shape under gravity. He told me about his job in sentences that didn't boast. He described the counselor's questions without trying to make himself the clever one. He did not say Melanie's name. He did not ask for a key. When we were both almost comfortable, he reached into his bag and set a small box between us wrapped in butcher paper and twine, like something you could trust, because it had nothing to prove. Inside was the 5th-grade mug newly glazed by a potter who specializes in repairs that make the crack part of the beauty. A thin gold seam traced the old fracture, making it visible and holy. I asked if she could fix it, he said quietly, and she asked if I wanted it to look like it had never broken or to look like it had and kept going. He looked at me like a man who has finally found the right teacher and is ready to be graded. This felt honest. I held the mug and did not pretend it was light. "It does," I said, and the wind chose that moment to move through the birches as if it had a stake in the conversation. He told me he had made his first 2 payments. He told me he had apologized to Lena and to the young agent who had overridden verification because a woman sounded so sure. He told me he had scrubbed our names from auto payments like graffiti from a wall. "May I sit on the dock?" he asked as he rose, and I nodded. He walked to the end and sat with his knees up like a boy and watched the lake choose a new color for itself every minute. He stayed until the light left and did not ask for dinner. When he stood to go, he didn't say, "I'll be back soon or next week." He said, "I'll text before I come, and I'll bring my own food." And if that sounds unromantic to you, you have never been a woman handed a plan that does not spend her. Late that night, after the windows were shut and the house had learned again how to hush, I opened the tackle box where my husband used to hide little instructions and found something I had overlooked in my first pilgrimage: a stub of a pencil and a stack of index cards rubber banded together. On the first card in his square hand, "Write your own notice." I laughed out loud, a sound that startled the darkness and then settled in beside it like a friend. So I wrote one, not for the bank or the court or even for my son, but for the younger version of me who had been waiting at the back of the kitchen all these years for permission to enter her own life. You are not cruel because your love comes with a spine. You are not abandoning anyone when you refuse to be their floor. You are allowed to be the person who locks her door and sleeps. You are allowed to ask paper to tell the truth. You are allowed to keep the house and the lake and the little daily rituals that make you yours. You are allowed to be thought difficult and live. I placed the card on the mantel beneath our August photograph. The two of us were in mid-laugh mouths, open eyes squinting the radio 3 songs behind what we wanted, and neither of us caring. I pressed the card into the frame until it held a thin white tab, announcing itself not as a warning, but as a promise. Then I stood there and said the benediction I wish someone had given me at 30, at 40, at 50, when the world was learning the shape of my patience. Peace is not silence. Peace is a house with doors that lock and a woman inside who knows where the keys are. If this story met you on a day you needed a stranger to make something brave sound ordinary, stay with me. Like this video, if it helped you find the words you were missing, share it with someone who is trying to rebuild a life with honest tools. Subscribe if you want more rooms you can sit in without apologizing. And in the comments, tell me the boundary you kept that saved you. I'm listening, and so are the women who haven't yet found their yes shaped like no.